Good afternoon. I am so terribly thrilled to be here and accompanying this very special book into its very first public outing, and all of you are here to celebrate this with us. So just a little bit about the book. When this project started, Ogo and I wanted to create the space to tell stories that are personal, but in those personal stories, showing how the personal becomes political, how the issues that we're grappling with as individuals in our society are, if I'm grappling with an issue of poverty or an issue of coming to terms with identity politics, you know, it's an individual story only when there are no dots joining the stories of all the individuals to form a communal and a societal picture. And I think that at this particular point in our democracy, almost 30 years of celebrating democracy, we're at a juncture where, you know, there have been gains made and we do need to celebrate those, but a lot has gone wrong. And it was very interesting to me to see, because we wanted predominantly to feature younger writers and also writers who, so there are some skilled and seasoned writers, but we wanted to predominantly feature writers who would not ordinarily get published, whose languages are not necessarily English. And it was a labor of love in putting the call out and getting the story. So for some of the stories, we could see the power of the individual experience, and the story was there, but the language was a barrier to get around, and ideally we need to be moving towards writing these stories in indigenous languages. But what we did was, with the support of the Heinrich Böll Foundation and the University of Fort Hare, managed to bring on board writing mentors to help those who needed help in shaping and crafting their stories. And the book is, it's special because we basically put out a call to say, tell us a story about your experience of social inequity. And, you know, as it is in this country, I was overwhelmed by the fact that many of the stories, the vast majority, have to do with violence, which says something about our societal story, our story as a country. But they're also the most personal experiences of poverty, of trying to access land, of place and spatial inequality, of trying to access a system of basic services that just doesn't work, that is broken. It tells the stories of people walking from rural areas to go to a primary healthcare clinic that doesn't have doctors, doesn't have medical equipment, doesn't have drugs, crossing a river, in fact, to get to a clinic. There's stories of searching for who we are, our sense of diversity, a sense of identity as a diverse society, and the fact that we have a very progressive constitution, but fundamentally we are not progressive in how we exercise respect for rights and tolerance for each other. So it's a really special book, and I do hope that you will support it. I'm doing my little marketing pitch. Karina Zurich, who's taking the picture over there, was instrumental in supporting and holding this project for me at times when I couldn't do it. And then on this occasion, I've got three of the amazing writers up on stage with me on my far left. I always, like everything is my left, I always want to say on my left and my other left. But on my real left is Cassandra Roxburgh. And I'm going to actually get you, Cassandra, yourself to speak to your story, but just to say something about Cassandra to those who don't know her, she's an asexual, non-binary, neurodivergent writer who writes about the environment, capitalism, trans identity, and all the messy details of being queer in South Africa. Faye has bylines at Mail and Guardian, News 24, Prism Reports, and Yes Magazine, amongst others. With a master's degree in law, Nohal, Faye identifies as a non-practicing intellectual hibernating in a capitalist system.
I wasn't expecting you to read that.
And then next to Cassandra is Sinelizwi, and we have some history. So I just need to tell you because I think it's special. Sine came to my home to interview me about a different book, a different collection called Nasty Women Talk Back, and I literally fell in love with her. Her mind, just the way she thought, the way her ideas move around, the way her views on the world and the country that we live in. And I just looked at this woman this day and said, I don't want to let her go. And so I keep finding inroads into her life and I'm still trying to like, hey, like be next to me, Sine, like I love you. So something about Sine is, Ncaluka is a journalism graduate from Cape Peninsula University of Technology, coffee snob extraordinaire, carries a deep passion for a world where freedom truly knows no bounds. Born in the 90s, Sine rejects the label of born free as she believes the fight for genuine freedom is ongoing for young black South Africans. Her professional alter ego shines as a campaign project manager and PR coordinator. With her unstoppable drive, she crafts and executes campaigns that connect deeply with the South African target audience, sparking inspiration and igniting meaningful conversations.
Thank you, Joy.
And then here, next to me now is my friend and colleague, Irvin. Irvin, I know you for long, but now I must nogal now read all your credentials. So I'm gonna just give a summary, okay? So Irvin is currently, we work together, but he's currently at UCT, working to transform academia and recruiting young black academics. He has an MSc in criminology, PhD in criminology also, former policing program manager, board member for the Center of Conflict Resolution, the former Chief Director for Policy and Research at the Civilian Secretary of Police, was content advisor to the Portfolio Committee on Police, and is now Associate Professor at the Center of Criminology, where he teaches courses in policing and crime. Hi, Jolene. Hi, Sarai. So, yeah, I want to start by asking each of you, this book deals with personal stories and the intersection between our personal stories and the society in which we live in. And so just to like give the audience a sense of where you each come from, where your story comes from. So tell us, and Cassandra, let's maybe start with you, like something about who you are.
Oh gosh. Caught me off guard there. Come from a very typical middle class background growing up in Durbanville, and I don't know, something about transitioning really thrust you from, well, me in particular, from this incredibly privileged presenting as male, get all the luxuries of presenting like that, into instantly, at least in the very like small community environment of Durbanville, kind of ending up being a pariah. I had numerous experiences where I had to change pharmacies because they wouldn't give me my hormones. And yeah, sort of came to being trans when I was 24 and grappling with the complete change in identity that comes with that, and now having to navigate the world in a very different way to what I was used to. That's been interesting. It's a constant learning experience of the extent to which men will render you into a sexual object for their own entertainment. It's great. It's especially as a lesbian, where it's like, I don't know why you're doing this to me. I'm not interested in you. Yeah. I don't know if that helps at all.
That helps.
It helps.
Sine?
Thank you. I was born and raised in Cape Town, so I've spent all my life in Cape Town. However, my roots, I come from migrant workers who came from Umtata. So I'm one of those kids who have like dual citizenship, as we call it nowadays, where you sort of commute between two worlds, you know, the Eastern Cape and Cape Town, Eastern Cape and Cape Town. So you constantly have to move around spaces, code switching, and, you know, change and identity and how you move and how the space accepts you. So I'd say that's pretty much the summary of who I am.
Yeah.
Irvin.
I was born in Cape Town, and so I grew up in Manenberg in Cape Town for most of my adult life. Done a lot of work with violence, been involved in violence, was stabbed a few times, and so arrested a few times, but not for violence. That was for politics. So I've become interested in understanding why people. I grew up in a very, very violent home, which is not exceptional on the Cape Flats. I think there's violence in almost every home on the Cape Flats. And so I've begun to question my own family's, my own parents' role, and I eventually gravitated towards gang mediation. I've always wanted to bring peace between people, and I've done quite a lot of gang mediations, and I ended up with the Center for Conflict Resolution eventually. And I wanted to understand why I moved that particular way. And so I discovered the records, our family records. And that led me on to this question of how violence is institutionalized through our governance structures in our country. Thanks.
So just to say that Irvin has a piece in the book that talks to him. He was working at Nicro, and it was your last day, Irvin, right? On his last day there was a party, a farewell party, and he happened to go to a filing cabinet, and he was, I think, putting a file away or looking for a file, and it was under K, and what happened was he found a file on his family. So we're going to talk about this, and he basically begins to unearth a story about his family accessing services at Nicro, and it then also triggers a memory of him coming into the place because he had a sense of association, but he wasn't entirely sure. And then it loops back to these memories of how he came there as a child and why. But I want to start, Sine, with you, because for me, you tell this iridescent story of Cape Town. Cape Town as we know it, and I am born and raised here. I have a great love for Cape Town. It's one of the most beautiful cities in the world. It's aesthetically beautiful, but it is deeply fucked up in some ways. And you know, when we look at the level of kind of just, you know, at one marker, for example, racial integration, you do not see the same level of racial integration in Cape Town as what you see in other cities like Johannesburg. So, but in other ways too, the markers of inequity are deeply entrenched. Like the pace of change has been slower. There are things that this is not about political parties, but I remember once, you know, because I'm interested in budgets and how money is spent by governments, I remember reading something about that nothing had been budgeted for street lighting services in Khayelitsha, and I tried to ask why this was. It was because people are going to break it. So we're talking about a system where there is inequity and there's a systemic effort to keep that inequity entrenched in the city. And Sine's story brings this to the fore, the abject poverty, this side of the mountain, and the beautiful homes that have rolling estates. And then as you come from the airport, the informal settlements that have fundamentally not changed since the transition to democracy. If anything, they've been expanded upon and growing out more. So talk to us about your story. Tell us about it. Tell us about your experience of spatial inequity in the city.
Thank you, Joy. My story in the book starts from just before the lockdown, you know, hit us, or before we all anticipated that we would have lockdown. So I had just come home from my usual December holidays in the Eastern Cape, and soon after that, I think around about February or March, we had lockdown. And my friend and I, who actually is here, found ourselves stuck in the murder capital, Nyanga East. And the experience of being there throughout the whole of COVID sort of highlighted, I think, obviously many things that we already know as Black young women, but also just made them so much more frustrating, realizing that basic services were absolutely not attended to. They were abysmal, right? So you walk past NY5, the graveyard, and you realize that the dead are living next to the dirt, for instance. The refuse bins are never picked up. There's no electricity, no sanitation, no proper schooling for the kids. You know, there were so many things, Joy, the violence, and I think also because of we come to the city and we go to work in the city and we stay in the residences, whichever universities you go to, so that you never really stay in the township per se. So once you're there living every single day, especially under the frustration of lockdown, then you get a different layer of what people who live there actually experience every day. So that was a very, very traumatic and terrorizing experience for us. The difficulty of just going to go buy bread at the spaza shop, for instance, not having access to e-hailing taxis or delivery services, which are like pleasures for us because when we were living in residences, right? But like for people who live there, you can't get postage. Your house has no house number, for instance, right? That system has never changed since the hostels were built in Langa, Guguletu, Nyanga, and so on. So no one can send you a letter. You can't claim anything from the municipality because you need to prove that you actually own this one-bedroom, structure that you call home, along with many other people, right, that you share the space with. So there's no sense of dignity, and the way that the people were living, the children were living, there's no trees in the streets, like simple things like trees for air, for people to access recreational facilities, for instance. So then you start to realize that these are spaces, obviously, that were intentionally manufactured and built for people to live like this, and no one has taken the opportunity to go back to the project of democracy and say, how do we fix this? How do we bring back dignity to people who have not experienced dignity or humanity in the longest of times? How do we ensure that instead of labeling these places as murder capitals and crime is rife here and there, what are the solutions that are there in place? So those were some of the challenges that we had to grapple with, being in that space, and also navigate speaking with the community, the people who are there, because obviously education levels are different, understandings are different, so we're seen as, you're standing out. Like, oh, those girls with a little bit of education there think they're better. So you also become a target in one way or the other, right? So it was a very terrorizing experience. So that's what the story is about.
Just because I also want to bring the voices of the writers who are not able to be in Cape Town, I'm going to just read you at this point a little extract from Zamasomi Precious Mbonambi's story, because it speaks to exactly what you're talking about. My name is Zamasomi Precious Mbonambi, also known as Mbijana, which translates to tiny. I'm 26 years old and come from a large family. My mother has 5 children, including myself, 7 grandchildren, and 8 great-grandchildren. For 26 years, we've lived in a shack. I don't know what it's like to live in a home with well-built walls, with running water and electricity. I still live here, but we've managed to extend it now. I'm working hard and smart to move my family out, especially my mother. I won't lie and say I enjoyed my childhood. I wanted to experience the freedom of being taken out and spoiled by my parents. When my friends spoke about how happy they were and the things they did, I would wonder how it felt to have those experiences. Small things like the specials they had from McDonald's or Spur, or the amazing cartoons they watched at the cinema. Growing up wasn't easy, but it did teach me to be stronger. It was a constant hustle, sharing the floor, which was our bed, sharing 3 slices of bread, sometimes eating the hard parts of the food, and sometimes going for days without food. From primary school, we had to walk a long distance to school and didn't even have school uniforms. The list of things we needed was long: uniforms, school shoes, stationery, sanitary pads, and oh yes, food. We couldn't afford so much, and we lived on handouts. Every morning when we were getting ready for school, we would take turns having a bath outside. To get the water, my siblings and I had to cross a very busy road and walk about 1 kilometer from our shack. Life was the same no matter what season it was. Fortunately, my mother used a Primus stove, so after our bath outside, we could come back inside and stand beside the stove to feel warm. Our shack wasn't perfect. When it rained, we all had to wake up and position buckets and dishes under all the leaking areas. I remember this one thunderstorm when it was pouring without remorse. We woke up in a pool of water. We lost so many things that day. Not that we had anything special or new, but it was something for us. Most of our official documents, our clothes, and even our blankets were destroyed. They weren't in a good condition to begin with, but they were all we had. We didn't recover anything and were a laughing stock in our community because we had to wear the same clothes and use the same blankets. So in a very visceral way, it's speaking to the lived reality of the vast majority of people in this country, and that fundamentally, some gains have been made, that things haven't really changed. And so I want to move, Irvin, you talked earlier on about the Cape Flats and violence, and what was interesting to me in an earlier session, I had Nshama Brody, and she wrote a book called Domestic Terror, in which she documents experiences of domestic violence, and one of this is having done some research on femicide. And news no news, but still I didn't quite actually know this, that the rate of femicide, so firstly, women are killed by their partners in terms of homicide. The vast majority are killed, so homicide, women are killed. The vast majority are killed by their intimate partners. Amongst the ratio is the highest amongst the colored population. And so there's something, while we're living in a violent society in general, there's something particularly going on in the Cape Flats communities. So before we get there, we're gonna go there, but I want you to just personalize that story in your story, which talks about domestic violence, violence in the home, which connects with violence in the community, but then also this institutional violence and the recourse that your mother sought in trying to access justice and contending with that brick, hitting her head against the brick wall and the institutional deafness as a response. So maybe just take some time to sketch that story and share with us.
Yeah, look, I think it's a story that's common to almost every other male child. And I want to single that out because women that I've spoken to over the course of the years of research and I want to talk about Manenberg because I did some research there. They don't want boy children because they die. They die on the streets. And so the lesson of the street to resolve your conflict, let's take it when you have to walk to school. And we used to walk in groups to school because we attended school at Manenberg High. I stayed there until, grade 8? Not grade 8, grade
You'd
10.
say my standard. Standard what, Irvin?
grade 10. And then I had to move to Spesbona because I wanted to do maths and science. And I see my former principal is here, Abu Solomon, so I just want to acknowledge him as well.
Welcome.
You have to walk in groups to pass the areas that are dangerous. And that still happens today with children, even at primary school. Because you get robbed, you get pointed out because you live in an area where there's a gang operating, even though you're not a member of that particular gang. And that's a critical thing because when you're a young adult in your formative years, there's a rule on all the streets that if somebody threatens you, you must react. You can't leave it. And so if somebody hits you or threatens to hit you, you're going to show him where you stand on the issue. You can't walk past it. That is the rule that governs, and that's the culture that's insidious within the community. So for young boy children in particular, it's something that you can't immediately extract from the lived experiences, because that violence is cultivated within the family as well. It's entrenched within the family when it comes to domestic violence. That's the way mothers and fathers resolve their conflict. And so sometimes young women stab their husbands and their partners, and vice versa. And so the child sees this and knows that that is the way you resolve the conflict. An ordinary butter knife, there was a toy project in Manenberg, and one of the observations made by the woman was that the young children associated the knife not with the butter knife, not with putting on the butter, but stabbing people. That was the use value and the purpose of the knife, was to stab people. That's the lesson you learn. So I think that roots of the violence is very, very, very deep. When the research around the violence in the colored community first came out, and that was early 90s by Ted Leggett, if you remember, I was very, very angry with his research, and I took him on. I also assisted Ted Leggett at the time, because he wrote about the criminality and the violence of the colored communities, and the fact that at the time, the colored community was the biggest single race group within our prison society. And that was true. So I felt that type of research singled out the racial aspects of the community. But now looking back after all these years, one has to learn much more when it comes to that. So accepting violence as a means to resolve your conflicts and your disputes, it's normal on the Cape Flats. And it's the impulse to violently respond to somebody that you cannot out-argue or that teases you. And there's another form of violence, of course. When we came home from school, we couldn't afford rent. And so often we were evicted. So we had to walk through a primary school to get to our flat. And you come around the corner with your group of friends, and there your furniture standing outside. That does something to your own dignity when you see the furniture there. So lots of people have different experience. Or they see their mothers in hospital. They've left them there. They come back, their mothers are not home. She's been beaten up, she's in hospital. So that violence, I think it's going to take quite a long time to resolve that. And I think that the only thing that can do that for us is education. It's working with NGOs, CBOs, schools, and you see teachers also sometimes wanting to become violent with the students because they can't deal with it. And I mean, I feel very sorry for a teacher in a school on the Cape Flats today. And I've worked with many, many teachers over the years. And you can see that they're beginning to lose their grip on how to deal with the child. I think, if anything, if ever we were to do trauma counseling services, it must be to our teachers. And I really mean that. Because the levels of violence that the children don't take their unresolved conflicts and leave it at home. They bring it to school. And they come and they want teachers to resolve it at school, or they take it out on the teachers. Let me stop there.
Before I move to Cassandra, I just want you to just sketch when you found that file.
Oh, yeah. I was working for Nicro. I enjoyed working for Nicro. I always knew the building in Zonnebloem. I always knew that I knew that building, but I never knew why. I enjoyed working and doing the work, and I worked with ex-offenders. Sometimes a person would walk into your office with Zailu nog tattooed in front of his head, and you've got to deal with people. So I had a little compassion for people that have been released from prison, and we had to find them jobs, and it was fantastic work. People don't do that anymore today because they're scared of the person sitting in front of them. And it was my farewell. I got a promotion to the national office, and so there were 42 social workers, and they were having this party, and they had the Felicia Mabuza Subtle show present, and we had closed the office at 12 o'clock, and all the receptionists were in front, and the client walked in there at 5 to 12, and we needed his file. His surname, let's just say, and this isn't his proper surname, his surname was King. So I went to look for his for this file, because I happened to walk past the reception, and my manager asked, just get this man's file so they can deal with him and send him home. And I couldn't find his file. And I was frustrated. I found my own file. Guinness. I got the shock of my life. And then it all came back, rushing back. It was my brother's file, my eldest brother's file. And he was at Victor Verster in 1973. And suddenly, you will not know what that does to you. Any person. All the thoughts come rushing back. All your memories come rushing back. My mother used to take us to Victor Verster. She used to fight to hire a car to get us to go and see him and so forth. And so I looked at the file, and I stood there. I was frozen. When I opened that file, our whole history was there. All the children, all the siblings. And you know the significant thing about that file was every time my mother was beaten up, she had gone to Nicro. She had taken us with her. And there was a record. The social workers of those years kept proper records. And there was a record, there was an entry that she was here, she was beaten up, this was the marks, and so forth. And I'm standing with this file in my hand, I must go into a party. So I was overcome with emotion, but I couldn't do anything. I stood there and I was frozen, and said to the manager, this is my file, I'm having this file, this is our family file. We were microfishing all the Nicro files, and we were destroying the hard copies, which is so sad, because there are lots of family histories that Nicro had. And I then took the file, closed it up, and I left it for about 3 weeks. My brother didn't even know about that, the history. He had forgotten his time in Victor Verster. He was eventually released on the 16th of June 1976. So that file became the basis of me making more inquiries. I gave him the file and asked him permission to be able to tell the story, not of his story, but my mother's story through his eyes. And I then subsequently discovered more records, family records. The city of Cape Town had much more extensive records that went back to 1968. We lived in a council flat. Do you know that the council kept records of everybody who lived in council flats? What televisions you had, the type of stoves you had, the furniture that you had, the conditions of the walls. All of those are in official records. And so I did a PIA application, and I got the file, and my God, I was shocked. I cross-referenced the NICRO file with the city's file, and it was far more extensive. I could confirm a lot of the issues, and then obviously, because we were 10 children, I could ask my brothers and sisters about certain events. Fantastic information. So go and look at your files, if there's anything. Thanks.
I think that what is also beautiful about that is that there's this excavating of your mother and this resurfacing of her and her story and the violence she experienced, but at the same time, so while there's let's just say that the official documentation was great in documenting what happened, in kind of capturing a history and a story, but it wasn't great in responding to the very obvious signs of violence. That was completely left unattended.
Let me just say about that. It was my mother. That's why I'm writing the book about her, that kept the family together. My father was an alcoholic. He had beaten her up regularly. And this is not an exceptional story, as I said. It's the story of a lot of the women on the Cape Flats. She knew how to care for in fact, she and 2 other women started the peacemaker movement on the Cape Flats as a woman, because they needed protection. And so every time she was beaten up, it didn't set her back. The problem was, in the official city council records, we couldn't afford a 50-cent rent arrears. Every single record ends with rent arrears, 1 rand 50, 3 rand 50 cents. And every time there was a record, there was a threat of eviction hanging over the head. And they didn't ask my father, because he was the legally recognized tenant. Women were invisible, but she was all over the files. So a critical thing about that is that they fought with her. She had gone into labor one day. They called her at Mowbray Maternity Hospital. Where's the rent arrears? It's all in the records. So go and look at your files. Thanks.
So now, I think that what is special about Irvin's story is that it's temporal, it's situated in place and time, and we want to think that that is historical. But Cassandra's story shows us that it's not so historical, that here we are, and we still have violence and prejudice showing it, manifesting in different ways. And so, Cassandra, I want to talk to you about, I think, what particularly struck me about your story, that really sat with me, was how you talk about an experience of violence and harassment, and how your cisgendered women friends normalize it and kind of welcome you into womanhood because now you've experienced violence. Will you talk to us about that experience?
Yeah, it was kind of surprising that that's what I decided to focus on rather than the actual experience of sexual harassment and violence.
Please tell us from the experience and go through everything.
Yeah, I'm not going to rehash the experience. It was very traumatic. But I was basically, I think I was DJing at a bar in Observatory and just ended up being sexually assaulted by someone in front of their wife, which is a very humorous part of you go to a metal show in Observatory and you decide to sexually assault someone in front of your wife. Your wife defends you. Yeah, a deeply traumatized society. But basically, after that, resolved the whole situation. The guy got kicked out and all of that, thankfully. I went back to the table of friends that I was with and said, oh, this thing happened. And the very first thing that came out of someone's mouth was, oh, welcome to womanhood. And somehow that triggered much more visceral rage in me than being assaulted, because I've been assaulted and raped numerous times in my life, even before transitioning. My first intimate partner. Yeah, not going to get into that. It's the whole thing. But yeah, I think the anger I had was this very multi-layered anger at just how systemic gender-based violence is still in our country, despite, well, you spoke about it today, our lovely strategic plans, which achieve absolutely nothing. And then the second layer of anger was that this is the marker that we apply to womanhood, that the sort of way to access femininity for trans people a lot of the time in South Africa is these very cisgendered, coded, almost experiences that you have to go through in order to claim gold and in order to claim womanhood. And so many of them are often through a lens of structural violence. And at the same time, I was writing and reporting on the gender critical movement in the UK and just seeing how these well-intentioned trans-inclusive feminists in South Africa were almost parenting very similar language to incredibly transphobic groups over in the UK of, well, you know, this only performing womanhood happens in a very particular way. For them, it's a very like biological, there are only two genders, keep out of our bathrooms nonsense, but to have it almost reduced to your first experience of womanhood, despite identifying as a woman for nearly 2 years by then, is, oh, you've been sexually assaulted, which is also predicated on an assumption that I hadn't previously been sexually assaulted. It was a very stark reminder of the deep wounds within our society that we kind of see play out in our media headlines all the time in a very clinical way. Like, if you look at the way we report on gender-based violence, it's very matter of fact that there's, I mean, that's just the nature of, you know, media reporting in South Africa. It's clinical, it's not rooted in emotional narrative. Our newspapers don't do that, which is valid, fair. But even when you hear it discussed on the radio, or anywhere, the conversations are we're just so used to it. We're so traumatized that it's so matter-of-fact and banal that we're just like, oh yeah, even me talking now and not even having a single emotion about being sexually assaulted is almost a sign of just the extent to which our society has normalized it. And yeah, violence has just become part of our DNA, I suppose.
We have encoded it in our DNA, but at the same time, it affects our individual and collective psyches in an indelible way. It's deeply etched into our being, and we are so wounded individuals navigating our way through the world. I mean, I find it very interesting that you talk about, again, that juxtapositioning of Cape Town, and one thing that we go, yay, we've got a Pride March.
I mean, the juxtaposition of it being observatory, surrounded by queer people, and then get hit with that, and it's just like, okay. This is meant to be the little, besides, you know, the Waterkant and Sea Point, the queer hub of Cape Town, but hub in quotation marks. I still think about that in a very out-of-body experience of, wait, that actually happened. Not the sexual assault, the kind of, the reduction of my identity to this one act of violence. You know, we talk about Cape Town being so progressive and inclusive, and reality is that it's only progressive and inclusive if you're a white cisgendered man. Well, it's white cisgendered gay man if you're talking about within the queer community. You know, even more so, you have to be white and cisgendered to get any kind of benefit of inclusivity and progressiveness in Cape Town. You know, access to health here is diabolical, despite it being an urban center. You know, Grooteski's waiting list for gender confirmation surgery. 25 years. That's the only one you can go to for public health, and it's still going to cost you R500,000.
25 years.
Yeah. Damn. I've given up on the idea of bottom surgery. Maybe I'll go to Thailand. I don't know. Maybe we'll see.
20 with 5 years is a long time to wait for.
Yeah, and you know, we have our MACO members talking about, oh, you know, queer people are celebrated in Cape Town, but then why even our Western Cape police, you know, even the ones that what do they call it, LEAP, the city security people, are egregiously transphobic towards people. And it's just like, well, you're going to claim, you know, inclusivity, but you don't have any viable training programs in to ensure that queer people are being protected when they engage with seemingly the only institutions that are meant to protect us from violence in South Africa. And it doesn't happen.
I mean, and the beauty of your story is the tenacity and the perseverance in the wake of this kind of institutionalized othering of people, how you craft your way and your identity. And
I didn't have a choice.
Yeah, but at the same time, Cassandra has given me my mantra. Can I please just read the last 2 lines of your story? Spoiler alert. I was sexually assaulted and there was never a headline. I'm not a survivor, and here comes my mantra. I'm a fucking warrior wrought from the wrath of Athena and Aphrodite. So that's my life, right?
Is it very obvious that I was obsessed with Greek mythology? Still am.
So I want to, before we, oh gosh, we're at that point where we have to take, oh gosh, what happened? What happened?
Yeah, that was quick.
Okay, Sunil, Lars, okay, it's their turn.
Okay.
But maybe I want to kind of just come back to what do you think are the single biggest things that we need to deal with as a society to address this, and this is a huge question, the magnitude of the inequity. And in the meantime, you can get your questions ready. Or alternatively, that's too much. What gives you hope?
Is there hope?
Is there? Good question.
I don't know. Like, I mean, I remember during Fees Must Fall, we were like, let's burn it all to the ground and start from scratch, you know? So it's tough to think about, or being hopeful and reimagining and all of those things when you are moving or departing from a position of nothing.
Yes.
Of wanting, like just the basics, right? So I am in the business of surviving today rather than being in the business of, oh, what does 20 years from now look like? What is the future? What is, you know, and I think that was the project that was supposed to happen in 1994, right? To say, how do we reimagine this country going forward? And that has failed. And so the onus for that to be on us is just a bit much, you know?
And so, and then there's a far broader systemic question, like how do we hold accountability for this dream that has never arrived, that has been prolonged, and that, you know, we're in a situation where we, at some level, do need to think about what is the legacy that we hand over to those who are to come, and whose job is it to resolve this? I'm going to open the floor for
If I can just
questions.
add something quickly
Yes, sure.
on the idea of the onus of whose job it is. Our institutions do a really great job of shifting the responsibility of fixing this country to the individuals, and at a certain point, you know, Irvin said this great thing earlier, legislation doesn't matter. Half of what we have to do to fix social inequity is fixing our culture, and I don't know how we achieve that with institutions that we currently have that fundamentally don't care about anyone other than the bottom line.
Agreed.
And the institutional deafness in the face of, I mean, I think that the one thing that we're very good on is saying let's have public participation exercises and let's hear citizens' voices in governance projects. And
So once every 4 years.
but there's no assimilation and actual listening and hearing to. How do you do public participation where it's not a tick box exercise, but you deeply sit and listen and assimilate and actually carry through on some of that?
Yeah.
Questions from the audience? And I just want to check, because we have, I want to say that we have the cover, and there's artwork in the book that is beautifully and carefully drawn by Zoe Maradek. Is she here today? Please can you stand and just like, yay. So this was Zoe's work, and Zoe, this was part of her matric project, and she's done some astounding pieces of art in the book. Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you, Zoe.
And we also have, I'm just going to like embarrass you and do this anyhow, Renelle Kukumur at the back there, who's got a beautiful piece in the book. Say hi, Renelle. And Liberty Mateus, who I haven't seen in forever, who's also got the most phenomenally beautiful story in the book. Thank you. Yay.
And Jocelyn there at the back as well.
Yes.
Jocelyn.
Oh, and Jolyn Young. Jolyn is at the back. Jolyn's also got a story. And Jocelyn, Jocelyn, I haven't met you. Jocelyn, can you please stand? Yay! Yay! Okay. Oh, if there are no questions from the floor, I'm going to carry on talking. Is that fine? Yes? Jolyn, yes.
Stories, and I'm touched by all of them, and also these are stories. I'm also a researcher that we deal with every day in South Africa, and I feel that we're never going to get in. We go around in circles all the time, and we're saying the same things. And I think that back in 1994, but it's not too late now, I think as South Africans, all of us South Africans need mass psychological intervention. We are a damaged society. Our governments are also psychologically damaged. We've been damaged by our history, and it goes all the way. I've looked at Cape slavery. I've worked in that field. I've looked at indigenous communities here. The violence started very early, and people talk about Cape Town. To understand Cape Town, you must understand the history of this particular place before South Africa happened. South Africa happened in 1910, but this colony happened in 1652, and it happened with extreme violence. So we need to undo it, and we can hate the people who are carrying this negative legacy, who are doing these things to us, but they are a damaged people. We are all damaged, and so we need to start looking with compassion at each other, because we can continue blaming, and another 20 years is going to go by, and it's going to be another 2 generations hating each other. It's going to be like what happens all over the world. So at some stage, we need to find healing, and I'm not joking when I say that our government needs to intervene psychologically. I've listened to the speaker speaking about Manenberg and the violence there. Go back to the history of Manenberg, the people there. Go back, and we're not just talking about forced removals. Go all the way back to slavery. Go all the way back to indigenous dispossession. And then you'll understand the violence. You'll understand the damage to men. Our men have been emasculated, and that is where the violence against women happens. So we can't just look at what's happening to women. We have to say, what is happening to these men? What has created that? Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you.
yeah. Of course, the work of Elaine Salo and Stephen Jensen looks at the emasculation of men, some of the works on it. But I think to respond to you, around institutions and governance institutions, I was at the conference yesterday where we looked at corruption. And we can't take out of the equation individual agency. All of us have it. All of us must become activists in our own way, wherever we are, whether we're in the church or in government or in our communities, because corruption is also manifesting very strongly in CBOs, NGOs, even in academia, deeply, because people see the state as a means of income. And so, not to lose the thought around this particular issue, these institutions of government, and I want to distinguish between government and governance, are run by men, principally. They are not going to give way in their decision-making process and their governance processes to bring on board all of these things. And so the law must be used as an instrument and as a weapon. And we've got to weaponize it in order to defend the rights that we fought for. Because if we don't, it's going to be our rights are going to be taken away in this issue. So I think that we cannot take away the individual activism that we want to see out. And how does that happen? Look at our kids and how they grow up. We all say we don't want our kids to grow up the way we grew up. I've got 2 sons. And I can see in them that they're far more relaxed. But there are times when that violent impulse, and Martha Cabrera writes about this intergenerational trauma. She writes about this, the sins of the previous generations having been carried by our newer generations. And it's carried over. And so I, as a man, in my own family, have to guard against that. Because sometimes it comes out. It comes out that you become angry and you want to take out your frustrations on your children. And that is why I say that if I were to make an investment here, it would be with our educators. The current existing crop of educators and those that are being trained to be educators. So apart from the family, not substituting the family, but our educators they need a break. Thanks.
In fact, Irvin, you've touched on a number of things that have been kind of put out there and kind of woven them together, that we have not named this thing of intergenerational trauma, that we come from a very specific history that has deeply defined who we are and how our interrelational ways of being Jolene spoke about mental health. Like, to come from a story such as our story, our collective story, it is impossible to not be psychologically wounded, and that this wounding is encoded into our DNA, that we act it out all the time. I know, and speaking for myself, in my rage, in my wrath, I incur all of that when there's a particular kind of trigger, that it's not just my story, it's the ancestors, those who have gone before, and I'm very aware that I've become middle class and have access to resources in a way that they don't, but I carry the wrath of their pain and their hurt and their anger, and I act that out sometimes. Sometimes justifiably so, sometimes just because I need to. There was a question.
Lose it.
Yes.
I want to touch on 2 points.
Sure.
Okay, can you hear me? What Irvin said about teachers. Yes, teachers have been wounded, and they come from, having to save these violent children, and they need counseling, and I don't know how it's going to be addressed. Then the legacy that of the pain, the inequality that I was born into, but my children, they do not want to hear it.
Absolutely.
That is my biggest frustration. They've now grown up in the Mandela era. They don't know why they act this way. It's in their DNA, right? So sometimes we want to tell them, we as parents want to tell them the story of apartheid and how it hurt us, how the society was so unfair. The first words that come out of them are, "Mom, I don't want to hear that story." And they are grown, they are 40 years old, and they go back into society. In which one do they go? How do they understand the legacy that we were brought up in? Thank you.
Can I answer that?
Yes. Let's just take the last question, and then I'm going to give each of you a round of closing comments. Okay, so there are 2, and so we'll take the 2 and then closing comments.
I don't know. I find it abusive, sort of, to the people who are marginalized, because the question of reimagining is always asked of the marginalized, never asked of the other side. And so it's always just a wondering of, we want to get there, we want to get to a place of social equity, but how do we do that? How do we get there when we are so divided by race, by the shade of our skin, by gender and sexual identity, so many, And so how do we get there, and how do we get to a point where we do not put the onus on the victim? Because, there are white people here in this room, and white people show up for these things, like open book. But, maybe one white person will show up for a protest about service delivery in Nyanga or Philippi or Gox, etc. But how do we get to, and I don't know who I'm posing this question to, I'm just saying, because it's a frustration that I myself as a black person, and I'm pretty sure a lot of other black and colored folk grapple with. How do we get to a place where all of the things that separate us are put to the back, and we can focus on the things that unite us, or the things that we can all identify with, because we're all affected by load shedding, or we're not. And other issues, gender-based violence, all of these things. How do we get to a point where all of our identifiers do not prevent us from I don't know, what's the English, focusing on the actual issue here? Because everybody shows up for these things, because, it's nice to show up for these things, and you meet with people, and you network, and all of these things. But when it comes to doing the real work,
how do we get there?
And that's not necessarily something that we can answer now, but it's such an important question and it drives how we think going forward. Okay, the last one, and then very quickly for the one line from each of the panel members.
I just want to throw the cat amongst the pigeons here. I'm an educator, so that's my habit. When we look at these issues that we are confronted with in our country today, we must try very hard not to be myopic, because it's not just a regional issue. It is not only a post-1994 issue. I've been a teacher for 45 years, and the problems that we are facing now, we faced then too. Maybe it has been intensified now due to all kinds of other factors, which we won't go into at this stage. But if we want to really solve the problem, then we must look at this problem not only in a regional or in a national way, but it's a global problem. Look at what is happening in so-called democracies in the Western world. Look at what's happening in America, which was supposed to be the icon of democracy. Look at what's happening in the West. Look at the intolerance. Look at the violence. Look at the incarcerations. Look at the insurrections. Look at the complete disrespect for human dignity that's happening in the civilized West. So what are we talking about South Africa for? Just a little dot on the tip of Africa. The whole world, the whole Western world, the whole of civilization is crumbling. All those values that we adhere to, that we cheered in the movies and in our local media, etc. To what extent are we not imbibed those values in our daily lives that we see in the media and in TV and in films, etc.? So we must do a hell of a lot of self-examination first and find out if we are not, in fact, imitating and perpetuating that value system. It's a system that we have to unpack. It's not the South African government only. It's not the Western European government only. It's a system. And what we should ask ourselves is, what is that system? And where does it come from? And what are its objectives? Before you're going to tackle your children's attitudes, ma'am, you must ask yourselves, what are they imitating? Where are those values coming from that they so hang on so passionately? Where does it come from? Does it come from here only? I categorically say no. Because if you switch on the TV, you watch a movie, American, British, wherever, South African, you see all those values unfolding in front of us. So we mustn't fight the South African government only. Yes, we must fight them, but not them only. We must fight a system. And before we can fight the system, we must find out what is the system. And how many of us know, or want to know, or wish to know what the system is. Because that system props us up and allows us to enjoy all the material benefits that we do. So we are afraid to unpack that system. That must be done first.
Thank you. That
Can I just...
our national inequity is situated in global inequity. So, Irvin, yes, you can respond in closing comments very quickly.
Quickly.
Then Sonia, then Cassandra.
The way that I want to respond to Abu is a good internationalist makes a better nationalist. And so our struggle is global. I agree completely. And so, but there has to be a starting point for every country that's involved. And none of the struggles that happen within these individual democracies or dictatorships, or whatever the nature and the form of the country, is individual. Our history is collective. It's humanity's history. And so I can only agree with what you say. To you around your children, this is why I'm doing my own book about my mother. I want our kids to know who their mother was, who their grandmother was, They never met her because she had passed on. And they need to know that history. And that's why I'm writing it. I don't want anybody else to write that. So you can do that too. That's the individual activism that you can display. The issues that's raised around the collectivity of our issues, we're the same. We have different levels of pain. And it's that we have to look at. If we want to go forward, then we need to help each other. Thanks.
Sine? Please carry on with the clicking, like, don't stop it.
It's tough to move forward without accountability. You know, like I think that's what the guest was trying to get at. So we need to look at things from a perspective of what happened, how do we become accountable, how do we talk, how do we listen, how do we not put onuses on other people and the victims of the situations that we're trying to grapple with. How do we create policies that return dignity to people, return humanity to people? How do we create systems and institutions that speak to who we are as a people, as Abantu, you know? So we need to go back to all of those things. That's the only way we can be able to, like the lady was saying, we find a meeting point as people. But without saying we are now talking about our shared humanity, but we are erasing what we went through or what we're still trying to grapple with. So how do we reconcile all of those things and still say, Cassandra, you're human, Ivan, you're human, and let's journey together for a better solution. I would end it off there.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
Cassandra?
To speak to the question of what is the system that's creating these prevailing values, it's ultimately capitalism. But to speak more to the idea of progress, I think the only way we really move forward is by turning to our communities and creating communities that actually, despite our differences within internal communities, that we all united in the common goal of human dignity. We all want to be treated with dignity and respect. And, even I struggle with that, with dealing with people that are transphobic towards me. I still have to meet them somewhere with empathy and compassion and try to understand where they're coming from. Don't fully understand it, but, the only way you sort of overcome a lot of the structural violence is by going to the root of that. And the root is not people, it is an amorphous value system that we have to dismantle. And the idea of hope is a practical tool for self-survival under capitalism, and I would spiral into chaos without nihilistic optimism, even if it drives me insane. Yeah.
It reminds me, thank you. When my daughter was in matric, I was having a conversation with somebody where everybody was talking about what their children were going on to study, and this woman said to me her son was being geared up for chartered accountant, and other people were engineers and blah-de-blahs, and my daughter wanted to do social science, and this woman said to me, but how's she going to get a job? Like, we don't need social scientists. And I argue very differently. Look at our country. We don't need more chartered accountants. We need the light workers, the peace builders, the social justice makers, the social scientists, the people who care. And something that Irvin said earlier on, that we are required, unfortunately at this point, for all of us to be activists. Like our world is fundamentally inequitable, and it has to be our praxis. It has to be what we live and believe and are striving for and walking each day, like challenging the social order that we have and subverting it. Like it's not going to fall out of the sky. And I think it's Audre Lorde who says you can't dismantle the master's house by using the master's tools. So we have to find the ways of dismantling using our own tools. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming. I so appreciate all of this. Thank you.